The title is a little bit different from what is written on the program, because I try to more accurately represent what this talk is about. I want to talk about transit crime, the built environment, and gender differences. It really captures my work on this particular topic in the last 10 years or so, or even more, actually from the 1990s. And let me see, so I'm moving it by, how do I move?
You did move.
No, I didn't move. I had a... We're not going to go too far if we can't.
Should I use just a second? Yesterday it happened. I can move for you.
You can? Okay, it works from the computer?
Yes.
Okay. So yesterday, actually, Vanya mentioned that safety is a right, should be considered as a right, and I very much agree with that. I would also say that mobility, physical mobility, which is the ability to move from one place to another quite smoothly, quite quickly, without obstacles, should also be considered an important citizen right. It is related to the accessibility, which is the ability to take advantage of the different amenities that we have in cities, the parks, the open spaces, the markets, the schools, and as well as to reach our jobs and economic opportunities. So these are important rights, but sometimes these are compromised if we have transit crime, and it is transit crime is something that happens, as we see in this conference, in different cities. It affects different riders differently, and I have to be looking, okay, great. And it scares and intimidates some riders. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so now it's working. Okay, oops, it's not showing. Okay, here, sorry, we have all these technical issues. So there are two things that my presentation today would like to address, drawing from my work from the past. The first, probably I would say, my first body of work on the issues of transit crime really looked into the question and the relationship between the design of the built environment, the physical characteristics of place, and transit crime, and asking how should we try to design and plan differently. But my more recent work is more interested in what I call vulnerable users, and I'm concentrating on issues of gender and how it affects mobility, and even more recently on issues of age and income and how it affects mobility. So the outline of my talk is as follows. I'm going to talk a little bit about transit crime and place characteristics, giving you a little bit of the theoretical background, and then I will turn to some of my empirical studies about transit crime in Los Angeles. And the second part of my talk, I'm going to talk more specifically about women and mobility and gender differences in travel patterns and some findings from empirical studies in the US. And I'm going to mostly leave the policy recommendations for the end of the day today because we don't have much time in this session. So the theoretical background of the work on built environment on crime comes in the form of criminological theories, and we have two basic types. We have ecological theories that really stress the importance of physical and ecological attributes and study the environmental context of crime, what the Brantinghams called the backcloth of crime. And we also have compositional theories that look into the importance of sociodemographic attributes, age, ethnicity, gender, class, social mobility, and they mostly study the offenders. And the two types of theories lead to a number of crime prevention strategies. The ecological theories, they really target the environmental context and try to design out crime. We have a lot of work by criminologists on situational crime prevention, and of course, the theories of crime prevention through environmental design. The compositional theories that look into potential offenders, they look into social and educational services, they examine policing strategies and criminal justice strategies. So a stream of research that is concerned with identifying the physical factors that form the environmental backcloth of crime and what kind of particular attributes of place may generate opportunities for crime are under this whole rubric of environment and crime. And that's where my own work falls into, where the studies of streets, of alleys, of bid-block connections that may represent escape routes, the study of land uses, and what I call negative land uses, such as liquor stores, bars, pawn shops, sometimes ATM machines, adult bookstores and theaters, their proximity to which bus stops. Some scholars, including myself, have shown that relates to transit crime. Physical disrepair and deterioration, the well-known broken window hypothesis, the physical and social incivilities and their relationship to crime, the natural surveillance opportunities that particular sites allow, and the Jane Jacobs, very well-known, eyes on the street, and even a subset of studies that really look specifically into density and how it relates to crime. And we have the development of environmental criminology in the late 1980s and 1990s that really inquires very specifically about these issues. And I would say that up to the 1990s, many studies did not show exactly which environmental variables affect what types of crime. I mean, when we talk about crime in general, we have very different crimes. We have crimes like rape that we heard a very interesting presentation by Vanya today, very, very different from pickpockets, for example, very different from sexual offense crimes. Each type of crime requires different environmental characteristics. It is more common under different environmental characteristics. Also, few studies had measured up to that time the physical environment directly and objectively. They were mostly focusing on subjective perception surveys. So here's a map, a GIS map from some of my earlier work that really looked into bus stops. And a lot of the common knowledge was that, of course, you have a lot of bus stop crime in unsafe neighborhoods. But this was not explaining, in my mind, why on the same bus route, a bus stop that was just a few feet, 100 feet away from, how do we get this again? Yep. From another one would be completely with no crime incidents, and another would have a lot of crime. And of course, as we know now, the answer comes into some of the microelements, the microenvironment of crime. So I undertook a very serious investigation of measuring, trying to objectively measure different aspects of the built environment. How close this bus stop was to open front establishments, how close it was to different alleyways, what was the lighting in each of these bus stops, and running a number of regression analysis. I will tell you a little bit about the results. This is another study of a metro rail line, and actually this was a new line in Los Angeles, the Green Line that had opened at the time in the mid-1990s, and the line was passing through some very high crime areas in the city and ending in the suburbs, in the affluent suburbs. And there was a lot of opposition at the time from suburbanites because they were afraid that it was going to bring crime to the suburbs. And we really had the opportunity to measure the effects of the line, and we found that no crime was not transported to the suburbs. And actually, it was very interesting, the presentation yesterday of rape that showed that it is quite rare that criminals are going to go very far away from their neighborhood. So the expectation that people are going to get on the line and travel to the suburbs, going to burglarize, and then get on the line and come back to their neighborhood was absolutely not true. So the unit of analysis in these studies was both the place and the space. And by the place, what I meant was a point in space. It could be an intersection, the surrounding environment of the station platform, the surrounding environment, the immediate environment within the quarter mile of the bus stop, but also the space, which was the two-dimensional area that contains the events, the specific situations, the spatial attributes and characteristics of the particular neighborhood and districts. And the studies collected data both at the place level, the microenvironment, as well as the space level, the larger immediate environment. And just to give you an idea, these were the type of indicators that I measured for the bus stops, factors that facilitated escape, land use factors, the condition of the built environment, the street characteristics, the bus stop characteristics. We had an army of trained graduate students that really measured quite objectively these elements. And as far as the transit stations, again, these were the different types of things that we measured both at the platform as well as the surrounding area, like the park and ride lots. And we don't have much time, but I will tell you some of the variables that were associated with high crime rates included the alleys and mid-block connections near the bus stops, the proximity of liquor stores and other undesirable establishments, the presence of vacant buildings and lots, rundown buildings, and street litter. These were all associated and statistically significant with more crime at the bus stops. Variables associated with low crime had to do with open front retail stores, better visibility and natural surveillance opportunities, the existence of a bus shelter, street traffic, and pedestrian presence. And these are actually two bus stop settings. On the left is a very high crime bus stop in Los Angeles. On the right, a very low crime bus stop. For the stations, variables associated with higher crime rates included the presence of large park and ride lots next to the station, because, again, I was finding that most of the crime was not on the station platform, where there were a number of people, but in the surrounding area. Underpass platforms, poor visibility, the existence of multifamily residential and retail land uses in the vicinity, liquor stores and other undesirable establishments, the presence of graffiti and litter and dilapidated buildings. Variables associated with lower crime rates included the presence of office and industrial land uses, well-kept neighborhoods, and good building stock. And here are some of the unsafe environments where there were stations with high crime, and some of the bars and liquor stores in the vicinity. There were also certain sociodemographic characteristics that related to station crime. Variables with high crime rates included high population density, more persons per household, younger population, and population with less than high school education. Variables associated with lower crime rates included owner-occupied units, higher income households, white neighborhoods, and population which was college educated. Now, these are the particular Los Angeles characteristics. This may be different in other places. This is a map that shows the kind of some visual correlations between crime and population density. And, oops, can we turn it on? Yeah. And crime against persons. We were also looking into different types of crime. All these studies have been published. Whoever is interested, I'm more than happy to send them there quite some time ago. So these were some policy recommendations that came out of these studies for safer bus stops, that the security of transit passengers should extend from the bus stop and the platform to the surrounding public environment, that to move bus stops from desolate places to places with better surveillance opportunities and more foot traffic, to upkeep and maintain the environment, and to conduct regular security audits. We were finding that bus stop crime was highly concentrated. 19% of the crime was happening at only a very small subset of bus stops, about 20 bus stops, were concentrating the crime. In terms of safer stations, let's put that again up, secure routes connecting to the station, secure station parking lots with smaller lots instead of larger lots, well-lit lots, better integrated to the urban fabric, increase police patrolling on park and ride lots, and even incorporate maybe some convenience stores and ticket machines with people on the lots. It keeps, yeah. Now, coming to the second part of my talk, it was pretty obvious in the surveys of transit riders that accompanied some of these more observational measurements that a certain subgroup was much more affected, of riders, much more affected than others. And this is actually a quote from a publication by Hamilton and Jenkins that talks about how women have very distinct safety and security needs. And it was very clear that women were much more fearful about transit crime than men. And in a much more recent publication in Town Planning Review, I'm discussing about the gender differences in travel patterns here. You see a table about women in the global north. There are some differences in women in the global south, but these are very specific differences that lead to very specific gender needs. And women are facing more barriers that affect their mobility. Some of these barriers are cultural. Women are mostly perceived as the primary caregivers for children, as well as aging parents. And they are primarily responsible for domestic chores. And the impact on their travel patterns, they take more and shorter trips. Oftentimes, they're accompanied by their children. They oftentimes carry large items during travels, like shopping bags. And they do what we call in transportation planning a lot of trip chaining, a lot of moving from one place to the other. And some of them are also characterized by what they call hypermobility. They have to take their kids everywhere, to the school, to the soccer game, et cetera, et cetera. But also economic barriers. A lot of women, more than men, lack economic resources for private automobiles, which means that they are transit dependent. There are physical barriers. Some of them are related to the automobile-oriented urban form and the sprawl that characterizes a lot of West Coast American cities, the lack of adequate infrastructure for walking, which leads to an over-reliance on private automobiles and long time spent on public transportation. And there are psychological barriers that relate to the fear of harassment and victimization, sometimes the fear that is instilled on younger women from parents about stranger danger. And this leads to avoidance of public transit, walking and cycling, the avoidance of particular transit settings and routes that we see in a number of our studies that we hear today, traveling only during daytime and traveling only if they're accompanied by others. And women have very particular fear of certain public spaces, and this fear is justified because of these factors that I don't have the time to go into each and every one. And in terms of their physical characteristics of spaces, women are particularly afraid of enclosed spaces with limited exit opportunities, as well as anonymous and deserted open spaces. And these are, again, from a lot of surveys with women that are transit riders. In terms of, they're also fearful of empty parking structures, desolate bus stops, empty train wagons. And this fear and anxiety, as we have heard over and over again in our studies of the recent project with Vanya and the other 16 researchers, leads them to change their behavior. So women's safety needs, a lot of women have told me that they prefer staffing to technological solutions. The fact that there is a CCTV, closed circuit television camera is not particularly helpful for a lot of women, because they say, if I'm victimized, someone may find out about it later, but what is happening now? So the policies that they view positively are request stop programs during late evening hours, taxi cab vouchers for low-income women, real-time information at bus stops, we talked about that earlier, public awareness campaigns, public signs. In the US, at least, segregated transport schemes received mixed results. A study that I did of 131 US transit operators shows, unfortunately, that these concerns of women are not being taken very seriously. Only 1/3 of these agencies believe they should do something specific about women's needs. They are afraid that they're going to be accused of reverse discrimination if they focus on women. Only 3 agencies out of 131 had initiated some programs. Don't have time to go much into that, but it shows this mismatch between what they are doing and what women want. And so I'm going to stop here because I have specific ideas and proposals that fall into these 4 categories: research, design, transport policy, and transport technology. But this is something we are going to talk more explicitly at the end of today as a panel. And so for the interest of time, I'm going to stop here and come back at the end of the day.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we will save possibilities for questions and some discussion when both papers are presented. So now I welcome Professor Mahesh Nalla